Okay, good morning, everybody. Hi, Keith. How are you? Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again too, Peter.
Welcome to our session today. My name is Peter James. I'm the Director of Career Life Transitions, and our subject today is difficult leadership conversations. So, Keith, I'll just get you to put yourself back on mute. There you go. And we'll kick off with the session. So we'll be here about 35 minutes. I do have some questions that people have submitted, so I'll try and cover those as we go through the session. And if not, at the end of it, we'll revisit those. So the session really covers what is a difficult conversation. And I think the second point is what's going on in your head and the head of others that derail conversations, because conversations per se shouldn't be difficult, and it's really the emotion that we add into it that starts to make it difficult. How could I master those difficult conversations, and how can I take this and use it in everyday life? And I'll give you an example where I've had to, I guess, apply these techniques just in the last week. So that's what we'll be looking at in this session today. So conversations are challenges leaders. From my experience, there are probably three key conversations that leaders have a problem with. First is those inspirational, almost leadership conversations that deliver clarity and purpose and focus. I think a lot of leaders that I've seen really don't appreciate the impact they're having on the broader community or their broader base through their behaviours, the words they say, and their actions. Some of the other things I might challenge leaders are thank you, recognition, appreciation to support engagement. And you see that a lot where leaders are very focused on driving results. There tends to be a focus on the negatives that may be holding them back rather than the appreciation moving them forward. And certainly people who have perfectionistic traits tend to fall into this category a little bit. And the last is those negative feedback, news or information to problem solve or deliver continuous improvement. So they're all important leadership conversations, but today we're going to particularly focus on the difficult conversation, which is that last category, that having to deal with or interact around negative information, if you like. So our premise is that if you take on a leadership role, and we differentiate very clearly between management and leadership. Management is all about policies, procedures, compliance, rules, regulations, KPIs, goals, objectives, all those type of things. Whereas moving that to the leadership space is moving that into a personal interaction, a relationship with the group. And that relationship is based on them as people and their interaction with you, not just the activities they're doing. So if you take on that leadership role, which shouldn't be taken lightly, it's your responsibility to understand the basic principle of people engagement, and to be the person to modify your behavior to meet the needs of the people you're aiming to lead and influence. So really the baseline of a leadership or a leader is that people want to follow them. Not have to follow them through the authority chain of whatever the organization you're involved in. So really, to be the bigger person, don't expect your followers to take the lead. And I guess the example I had last week was I was hiking, and we're hiking basically 5 days out. So we're camping and hiking. And my colleague, for some reason, decided to go off the track. And basically, we got separated. Now, I knew that I would meet up with him at a point further on. So I stayed on the track and moved to that next point. When he came off the track, when he came back on again, he thought he had lost me. Now, I'm at this next spot waiting for him, and it was on the beach, and a huge wave came up there while I'd take my pack off, waiting for me, caught my pack, soaked my boots, soaked my pack, soaked everything. So we now have two situations where two people could possibly be quite upset. And when my colleague finally made his way into the camp I was at, he was really, really angry with me, because even though I wasn't one that left the track, he was very, very angry. And at that stage, I must admit, I wasn't too happy about waiting for him, having all my gear soaked with seawater. But I knew I had to look forward and say, what do I want out of this interaction? And what I wanted out of that interaction was to enjoy, because we're only halfway through, enjoy the rest of the hike. So I put my emotions aside and apologized to him for the way he was feeling in the situation, being distressed about not being able to find me and frustrated by that. Now, had I not done that, that difficult conversation, which was difficult for me because I was equally angry, could have turned the other way, and we might have spent the next 3 days not talking to each other. As it was, we were able to resolve that reasonably quickly and get on and enjoy the rest of the walk. So these, I guess, are the little interactions that you have with people that can derail the conversation. If I'd left that, we hadn't spoken for the next 2 days, and we probably would never speak again at the end of that. So the decisions we make and the behaviors that are in our control in these difficult and challenging circumstances can really start to impact the outcome. So you need to ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve here when I enter into this difficult conversation? And a lot of time it isn't about protecting your emotion. So what makes it a conversation challenging? Well, there are different opposing views and interpretations, your own fears, personality concerns, or position. And certainly for my colleague, he had fears that he had lost me, or that I had abandoned him, or wasn't taking notice of where he was at. Subjects that trigger emotion and feelings, he certainly felt that. And where the outcome is important. The examples of this are in a relationship or dealing with a rebellious teenager, giving teammate feedback on poor behavior, or critiquing their work, or talking to a co-worker about personal hygiene issues. All those kind of things start to make conversations challenging or difficult for you delivering that message. So I want to talk about what makes it tough for me, or what makes it tough for you when you go into it, because a conversation is just a conversation, it's just an exchange of words, but what elevates it into a difficult conversation is the emotion that goes into that. So any kind of challenging interaction where emotions involve immediately alerts a fight or flight or even a freeze trigger. And people can jump to a position that is aggressive, defensive. I'm right, you're wrong, and try and get them to take the blame. On the other extreme of that is people move into an avoidance or an attempt to protect themselves or their self-image, which then is that backs into a passive defensive style. So when people are put under pressure, if they have a behavior or a predetermined tendency to jump to passive or aggressive behavior, that's where they'll go when they're put under pressure. And when anxiety goes up, our heart rate goes up. And when our heart rate goes up, our capacity to think clear reduces. And so we quickly jump into the space of getting this over and done with as quickly as possible. We resort to either or choices around avoiding conflict or telling the truth. We stop noticing how we're physically reacting to triggers, and we are not noticing how our behavior is starting to trigger the other person. Now, all those things start to accelerate, and this is happening in you in that emotional, stressful state. And you're starting to now make fast, quick decisions that are self-protecting rather than engaging in the broader group, and taking that time to actually recognize you're going down this track and taking steps not to check that and make different choices as these triggers hit in is about leadership. Now you all sort of see that, I guess, the words start when things get very, very stressful, and you'll certainly notice this with your partners or people that are close to you, that your words are now only a fraction of the communication you're having. And tone, attitude, body language, all those type of things start to really, when I am under stress and threatened in some way, I'm noticing those things a lot more than I'm noticing the words. So that's where this physical interaction starts, which starts to basically accelerate the disconnect. Now, this is important when you're building a team, working with leaders and what have you, because the Integro model, looking at what builds trust. Okay, the 4 areas of trust are acceptance, openness, congruence, and reliability. But if I take them back out and have a look and see what make up each of those 4 areas, if I start with the top, acceptance, who you are is okay with me. The 2 things that sit in there are recognition and respect. Now, when you go back, when conversations start to go south, the 2 things that start to fall out of that conversation are, I have a respect for your point of view, or I'm recognizing where you're coming from, which means that it's moving now from a pragmatic conversation around something that is observable into a interpersonal conversation where emotion is involved. And I start to inject a level of disrespect if I'm not listening to how what your view is, or not recognizing where you're coming from, which means that I'm now starting to damage that acceptance. When I jump to the bottom one, congruence, what I say is what I mean. That straightforwardness is I guess, if it's taken in an aggressive form, that straightforwardness can be too blunt. Or whether I start to come in honesty, if I feel like I'm being polarized and I need to defend myself emotionally, I may make some decisions where I start to throw out a couple of little white lies that really start to support my point of view. So the conversation, reliability is I'll say what I'll do. That starts to become an activity point of view. And when we move into receptivity and disclosure, am I comfortable to have those direct and open conversations in a format where it's managed with respect rather than presented either in a passive or an aggressive way? So when it comes to building trust, when we start to have difficult conversations and we start to ignore the emotional, physical, and the words we use in that interaction, we are damaging trust with that person. And sometimes that trust may never return if you're dealing with extremely difficult conversations. So what does all that mean? Well, if I sit back and have a look at Lencioni's model of the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team, trust sits absolutely at the bottom, which means if you're not having conversations with your team that are difficult and putting on the table and working through your ability to feel confident to have a direct conversation, you feel confident that you're not going to be emotionally attacked under those situations, that without that, then I'm never going to move up the pyramid of cohesive teams. So great teams have incredible trust in each other. So they recognize and accept the context of which things are being presented in, that they have the ability to be open and have honest those conversations, to feel that those conversations can be robust without turning it into an emotional attack. Then we start to move up the time when I can have that conflict, the constructive conflict, and then I can move on to the commitment, accountability, and results. And that's why it is very, very important to have these important conversations and these difficult conversations. If you let them pass by, if you accept behavior that is counterproductive for what you're trying to achieve, and you feel like you can't have that conversation, already in some ways you are starting to damage that level of trust. And even if that level of trust isn't with the person you're avoiding the conversation with, it can be a level of trust that's being damaged by the broader team that are watching that interaction you have with that individual. So if you have a team and one member of that team is being disruptive in some way, as a leader, if you don't have that conversation with that person, the other members of the team will then start to feel that you cannot be trusted. And that will erode your ability to build a great team. So Lencioni goes, by building trust, the team transforms conflict into something powerful and constructive. You can't have constructive conflict if you can't build trust. And you can't build trust, you can't effectively manage difficult conversations within the team. And that's an important component of why trust is important and why having the ability to have and manage what you may perceive as difficult or challenging conversations is important to you as a leader in the broader team. So when things go wrong, another story I wanted to relate, a little case study, was talking to someone in the health industry, and the health industry it's working 24 hours, and there are managers moving in and moving out and what have you. Anyway, under the certain circumstances, there was a little bit of breakdown of communication between two managers. And this is a high care area where there wasn't the usual overlap of supervisors for the area, which means there wasn't a handover, which is demanded by the policies and procedures of the organisation. So missing this handover, that was brought to a senior manager's attention. Now that senior manager just marched straight into the offices of these two supervisors and gave them both barrels for not complying with the requirements of the organisation, having their handover and passing that information. And I guess talking to the HR department of this area said, well, that's where things really started to get messy, because the two supervisors had made some attempt to hand over. They had made some contact via email to pass the information on. Yes, something had fallen through the cracks, but it wasn't through the best efforts of the two managers. But the end result for that organisation was one of the managers, the supervisors, as a result of that conflict interaction that their manager had, one of those two supervisors went on stress leave, and the other manager, the other supervisor said put in a bullying complaint against that manager. Now, talking to the HR department, they said this just created about 40 or 80 hours worth of work. We ended up with being two supervisors short. We had to fill in those roles. I mean, just for that senior manager not being able to have a constructive conversation about what was going on created a massive chain of events, a domino effect in the organization, which was enormously destructive moving forward. And that's how these little things start, just with someone getting a little bit emotionally involved, because there was probably, for that senior manager, there was probably some negative impact for them. But certainly handling that poorly had a domino effect, which had a massively negative impact on that organization capacity to deliver services over a period of time. And that's how these things can escalate. So if we look at what's going on in the heads of people, if you like, it's an extremely complex series of events, and certainly is happening in microseconds. So someone has a life history, they have core beliefs, which potentially includes beliefs about maybe they're unlovable, unworthy, or helpless. If you look at CBT, they developed a set of assumptions, attitudes, and rules about how they interact with the world, and they roll out a coping strategy to ensure they make themselves psychologically safe. And that's a word that's being used quite a bit at the moment. Do I feel psychologically safe? They roll out their coping strategies to ensure their psychological safeness around certainty, status, autonomy, relatedness, fairness. Then they enter into a conversation. Now, their automatic thoughts in relation to that conversation will feed back to their core beliefs and will filter back through their assumptions, attitudes, and rules and their coping strategy. They'll add meaning to that based on that coping strategy, and you will get an emotional and a physical response from that, and you'll get the behavior. Now, this can be positive and negative. It's not meant to be. It's not this is the way people think negatively about things. This is the way people think about anything, whether it's happy or whether it's jealousy or any of the major emotions. It tends to go through this sequence of events. So you're seeing at the surface the behavior, but what's going on behind that is quite complex. And if you're moving into a leadership role, you really need to be sitting back and starting to understand a little bit about how people think, why people think the way they do, and where they may be coming from in stressful situations, because this is what's going on in the background. So David Rock's SCARF model is a great place to start if you're looking at leadership and communications. And I would encourage you to go and, I guess, seek some more information on David Rock's model through YouTube and what have you. But basically, he's saying that the social threats social and threats and awards that people see in the workplace sit around status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So we're moving towards these things when we're trying to establish ourselves, and we're moving away from these things when we feel there's some threat. So if my status in the organization, or my status in the community is being threatened, you're likely to get a negative response from me. And as I say, this isn't for everybody. We are operating at different levels. Some of these things are important to some of us. Some of these things are not so important to us. If my certainty is a trigger for me and I'm looking for stability, if I create an unstable environment, you're going to get a negative response from me. If I threaten your autonomy, your ability to make decisions or what have you, once again, a negative response, or threaten the relatedness, in other words, the relationships I have as part of the team, my friends and my broader, and fairness. And I kind of fairness, I guess, would be one of mine. So I recognize fairness where someone is sitting back and looking at situations and say, this is not fair. Then you're going to get a negative response from that person. In the same way as I provide these things for somebody, recognizing this is what they need, then I'm going to, that's almost rewarding someone. If I promote someone, provide certainty for them, give them the autonomy to make their own decisions, I build them as part of a team, or I ensure that my interactions are fair, then I'm going to get a good response from these people. But when communication is done poorly, it is likely to impact on all of these areas. So you're likely to get an emotional triggered response from someone you're interacting with. So if we look at the DISC model, and some of you may be aware of the DISC model, some of you may not be aware of the DISC model, and I'll just, I won't cover that, but really in its base form, the DISC looks at, I guess, the behavioral preferences that people have. And it looks at them in this matrix, whether people have a high need for control or a low need for control, as opposed to a low need for affiliation or high need for affiliation. And this looks at the challenges that that particular behavioral preference of an individual has. Now, if we look at dominance, although their strength may be straightforwardness, in other words, they're quite comfortable to tell you exactly the way it is, the challenge for them in communication is acceptance. So in other words, they're more than happy to tell you the way it is, but they're not so happy about you telling them the way it is. If I move on to the influence side of it, their strength is openness. So they're more than happy to be open and welcoming to interactions and what have you. But they will have a challenge in terms of building trust because their reliability, but because they're open and happy to meet the needs of everybody, sometimes things fall through the crack. So they're not actually maintaining that ability to deliver on what they say they'll deliver. When we move down to the steadiness side of it, their strength is acceptance. So they're more than happy to take feedback, but they're, once again, they'll take that feedback, but they won't necessarily provide that feedback back the other way. If you move on to the conscientiousness, although they're highly reliable, they will withhold and they won't be open about how they're feeling about things. Now, regardless of where the behavioral preferences sit, people still need these interactions. So if you have someone that's very, very quiet, studious, doesn't need to be a part of a team and getting a job and doing a good job at that, it does not mean that they don't need that interaction, that positive leadership. It just means that the behavioral preference is not putting that as a priority. So if you withdraw that from them, then you will get the same negative impact that you would from anywhere on the spectrum. So just recognizing that people see the world differently and that the way they see the world does influence the way they provide communications and accept communications is important. Just recognizing that people are different. So we have the ladder of inference, and this is a great study if you want to do once again, some background information on this. But this is how, I guess, we accelerate interactions or even observations in terms of when a conversation can go south. So if we even relate it back to the story I told you previously about the healthcare center, there is real data and experiences. In other words, an event happened, it's observable, it's measurable, in itself is just an event. That managers come in and had a look at that and selected data and experience and said, there may be some background to that. There may be some impact that this person is feeling as a result of that. So they've now started to filter and select the data they want out of it. So rather than sort of sitting at and looking at all the information, they've now selected and said, Supervisors haven't communicated with each other. The medical center has been left unsupervised for a period of time, which is against the rules and will impact poorly on the organization. And I'm going to be in trouble for this. That may have been what's left in terms of the filter. So then I start to affix meaning to it. Is this a threat or a benefit to me? For that manager wants to go, this is a massive threat to me. Okay, my authority is being challenged. A control is being challenged, and the delivery, my KPIs may be being challenged. So then we start to make assumptions. We think we know what others' motivations are. These supervisors, you can't get good people anymore. They don't care about anyone but themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are assumptions that are totally untested. We then draw conclusion. It must be that they're doing this maliciously. They don't care about the patients, and they don't care about the organization. Then we start to look for confirmation bias, the things that we bring in that say what you believe is true. And the action that person took, that senior manager took, was to go in and give both of those supervisors a royal bollocking for that sequence of their filter of the observable behavior, which is not really what happened. So trying to draw that line right just above line 1 there about the real data and experience, what really happened, is very important if you take on a leadership role and you're about to go into a leadership conversation, because everything above real data and experience will be a filter system that you are building into the situation. It may flow up there that something needs to be done, and it was incompetence in some way. Well, what am I trying to achieve out of this? I'm sure when that manager went in and gave those two people a royal bollocking, that their goal at that particular time was to close down that department for a week while we worked through bullying complaints and stress leave and whatever. I'm sure that was not the intent, but it was certainly a consequence. I'm sure the intent was to modify behavior. Well, if you want to modify the behavior, you really need to go back and research and say, well, what was the specific, not what was wrong with this situation, what's missing in this situation? And they may have found with a little bit of research that in actual fact, it wasn't anywhere near as bad as they thought it was, and that the supervisor does not deserve the treatment they got, because the supervisor will be immediately thinking, this is unfair. I did everything I possibly could, and I'm getting a bollocking for it. And that's where the whole conversation has gone south. So behavior tends to drop into a defensive style if we're threatened, if we're not aware of it. And in the passive space, that is around seeking approval, agreeing for the sake of escaping the conversation, falling back on the rules and regulations, blaming others for the situation, or just playing silent. So this is not a constructive way of dealing with any kind of conflict or challenging conversation. But I'm sure you've seen people deal with them that way. On the other side, of the aggressive side of it, is trying to control the situation, creating a competitive win-lose scenario, or attacking and labeling. Once again, although it's passive and aggressive, neither is constructive. So the question is, well, how do I interact in a constructive way that delivers results that a leadership or leaders require in the situation moving forward? So this is a constructive pathway. And the first question you need to ask yourself before you have any kind of challenging conversation, or even when a challenging conversation is thrust upon you. I've certainly been in a situation where I've innocently said something and got both barrels back the other way. And suddenly I find myself in the middle of a conversation where 3 seconds before I was perfectly happy and not expecting that my day was going to be challenged in that way. So what do you want to get out of the conversation? What is the bigger picture here? And then it's a matter of starting to gather the facts, separate opinion, clarify what you're trying to focus on, and trying to separate that behavior, not in terms of malicious behavior, but intent, and gathering the broader facts as to what's going on, and trying to suspend your problematic inner voice and emotion. It's about listening carefully and genuinely and being prepared to share the impact on you that needs to be. So if it's quite an aggressive, your conversation may be a first to try and remove that emotion to it, because when we're attacked, we tend to either step away or we tend to step up. But in a leadership role, and certainly these difficult conversations, so sometimes you need to put that on hold. Pay attention to and acknowledge the feelings and behavior of the others, and suspend that malicious interpretation and explore there's something is missing angle here in terms of what's going on. Exploring different interpretations and the stories and the angles that people are coming from. So here I'm going back and trying to work through how someone has drawn that conclusion rather than reacting negatively to their response to that conclusion. And sometimes our assumptions about the intentions are wrong. So sometimes it may be reframing that conversation a little bit. Listening intently, asking, mirror, paraphrasing, those type of things. Curious engagement is important. And being careful of the language you choose to use, the body language you present, and the impossible interpretation of your words. And I know this is getting quite deep, but I guess once I start to suspend that emotion, then I'm not going down that path of personal triggering, where my heartbeat is going up, where my body language is starting to move into some defensive mode, whether it's aggressive or passive, all those kind of things. If I can suspend that for a minute and listen intently to what's going on and react to what is being said in a non-emotional way and pick that apart, then I'm not, I guess, escalating that difficult conversation into a negative space. And then it turns into a problem solve mode. What do we need to do? What do we need to action we need to move to? And it comes back to, what do you want to get out of this? Am I trying to retain the relationship? Am I trying to change some behavior moving forward? Am I trying to engage someone in a particular role? Am I trying to move? I mean, there are lots of situations we find ourselves in where conversations pragmatically on the surface don't look like a problem, but once I throw emotion into them, they start to become emotional. And it can be things as simple as moving your desk in the office and repositioning or joining a new team, things like that. People attach emotion to those things. So in summary, if the aim of your difficult conversations falls into one of more of these categories below, stop and rethink your way of approaching it. If you find yourself drifting into that, proving that you're right and they're wrong, then that's a point of stopping, okay? If you're looking to punish them for a perceived mistake, and let's face it, a lot of the anger that we sense, and certainly, you know, my story I'm on the track, I'm sure my hiking partner wanted to punish me for a perceived wrong that I'd done. If you believe it's being done with malicious intent, and once again, I don't believe anybody comes to work to maliciously, with a malicious intent in any of the activities of work. I believe everyone comes to work to do the best they can with what they have. But if you start to think there is some malicious intent, stop and rethink again. If it is proven that that action is malicious, then that's a completely different conversation. But I guarantee you that 99% of the time, it won't be. If you are in your head thinking about ignoring the story and getting ready to deliver your story, stop. If you want to sweep things under the carpet, in other words, a passive response to that triggered conversation, then once again, stop. If you're trying to protect your ego, your title, your office, your position, and things like that, rethink it. Or force your views and ideas on others, that's not going to work either. Or rejecting anything that wasn't your idea. So these, I guess, are the order responses that we see when difficult conversations are triggered and emotional starts to kick in. And for different individuals, it will be different things. We all approach these things slightly differently, and we will be triggered in different ways depending on the stimuli that's presented before us. So that brings us to the end. And I guess I just wanted to go back and have a quick look at some of the questions that came in. Robin asked, I'd like to know how to respond to people who do not want to move from their comfortable habitual patterns of work to embrace new methods and technology. I guess that started to move into a change management process, but certainly in terms of that conversation, you need to be having to refocus that if they do not want to move, then, how do I frame that conversation? At some point, it may come to a situation where you need to be having a harder conversation with them, but you can't move someone who doesn't want to move. So the first step then is creating an environment where they do want to move, which, as I say, is good change management. And at some point, if they're refusing to move to a new role or task, then now we're having a different conversation. Manage that they resist change. Once again, a difficult one. And if a manager is resisting change, then someone that's reporting that manager is unlikely to be able to influence that. You would need to engage that manager's manager or the board organization in that discussion. Conversations or relationships to deteriorate into the negative is huge when there is a need to address tough or touchy subjects. So hopefully I've covered that off in the presentation so far. And how to clarify misunderstandings or address conflict when there are entrenched behavior patterns, always listening through a lens of, well, a lot of that time I then start to call behavior. Once again, if you can remove the emotion out of it and start to pragmatically look at the behaviors and what have you and point the behaviors out, then you're more likely to engage someone in a meaningful, constructive conversation than if you start to label or make judgments on emotional behaviors and interactions. So I guess the key to these kind of conversations is coming back and saying, what do I want to achieve at the end of this? And if you have a look at the interactions you have, even with family members and things like that, a lot of the time the reaction we got at the end of it was probably not your intent. A lot of time your intent is probably to modify behavior or correct behavior in some way. But doing that in an aggressive or defensive manner is not going to achieve the outcomes you're looking for. So, Charlene, that brings us to the end of the presentation. As I say, career life transitions. This is my opportunity just to talk to you a little bit about what we do. We do provide a range of support services to organizations, especially around the engagement and management of your staff and employees, whether it's through resilience training, leadership and development coaching, outplacement support, restructure planning, change management, transition to retirement, organizational development. We do a lot of work, individuals with coaching and coaching with teams, especially in the space of leadership. So that is career life transitions. And as I say, we have quite a range of organizations where we're working with blue chip companies in Perth and around Australia. So Charlene, I'll open it up to questions. Do we have any questions at this stage?
I haven't had any questions come through except for around the slides and presentation, which I will be sending out once that's all put together.
Yep.
Lenore has said very informative, thank you.
Excellent.
Is there any other questions that we can have for Peter?
All right.
I think that's it. I think
sounds
we've
like
covered all the previous questions. So
okay, fantastic. So thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for taking some time out this morning to spend your morning with us. Wishing you the very best for the rest of the week and the weekend. And rethink those, look for those situations where there's difficult conversations coming up and rethink about the way you're approaching it. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.